It's me, Nails, here. Fallen Angels by Walter Dean Myers. Uh, Not sure when this book came out. Sometime between 1983 and 1988. Records are not clear. This is a Vietnam War novel. Extremely brutal, extremely intense, very believable, well written. I give it a 9 out of 10. It's a pretty quick read. There's some parts in the plot that lose momentum, tend to sag, only with the redundancy of missions, but it's still well paced, nuanced, without being boring. About 310 pages. Walter Dean Myers sadly passed away in 2014. At this point in my life, this is the best Vietnam War novel I've ever read, and probably in my top 10 war novels that I've read. And what it really comes down to is just the overall immersion and believability. There's so many examples of this. It's clear that the author did his research. I don't think he had actual experience in the military, but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, this feels like a first-hand account, down to like the way soldiers speak. They seem like they just came out of the ghetto of New York or Chicago, places they're from. That sort of thing. It's technically in the YA first person format, but this doesn't feel like a YA novel at all. This is totally mature and one of the most gruesome, harrowing war novels I've ever read. That if there's a theme, an overall point to the book, it's basically trying to inform a young person, or anybody really, people young at heart, over the realities of warfare. Vietnam is the greatest place to do that because Vietnam was especially brutal because of guerrilla tactics, anxiety, mental illness from the nature of so many negative conditions, and then underlying all of that, especially for this being the American point of view version of that. The underlying cause that led to all those negative conditions of failing morale and then subsequent negative mental states of mental health was the politics, which is that Vietnam was kind of a clusterfuck. It wasn't really, it should have never really happened in the first place. There was so much corruption surrounding it. It was a disaster. And so the main character Perry is a 17-year-old black guy who is basically sent to Vietnam by mistake, ends up doing the dirty work. Next thing you know, he's in the war, like on the front lines, that sort of thing. And then making friends along the way. A lot of his friends getting killed. One of the nice things about the characters is that they don't have a lot of life experience at this point in their lives to compare anything else they've experienced to it with. Military loves guys like that because they don't really know that they're being exploited for their politics and their effort, and they don't really know any better. Some of them figure it out along the way. By then, it's had that soul-sucking effect on them. And throughout the book, they become killing machines, totally dehumanized from what they're doing. Their souls are being pulled away from where they physically are. They're just mentally demoralized and destroyed by war in a way that is really beautifully said at one point towards the end. Perry basically says that they were all dead inside, and didn't really know if they were ever going to come back from it. So yeah, this book is so meta in the way that, from the redundancy of missions to just the prose is so brilliant, the pace is quick, and it's narrated in a way that really puts you there, makes you feel like the main character. You get this period detail too, like there's the military misinformation, the ugly truth of realities of war, civilian casualties, gore, unfairness. No amount of preparation or prowess always helps determine who lives and who dies. Soldiers sometimes stressing out and drawing upon each other. Things that nobody wants to see. There's another moment where Perry says, like, it felt like the things he was seeing was something that he should have never happened, or something forbidden that he's seen that he doesn't want to be seen. And so that's what this book feels like as you're reading it. It feels like an experience like being sick or ill, or you're slowly losing heart or losing faith in what you're doing. You're losing not in the book itself, but you feel like the characters so much that it actually is challenging to read because it's so ugly and depressing, and it doesn't hold back on anything. This is not a safe novel. This novel is one of those things that doesn't cut back on anything. It's the real deal. Combat scenes are totally believable, totally well narrated, executed, that you get like an adrenaline rush from it. The plot gets a little redundant, and similar to how missions would get redundant and make soldiers into these robotic killing machines in Vietnam, basically just feeling like they're another cog in the wheel of the war effort, which is what the military wanted at the time, the U.S. military. And so, because they didn't want soldiers to stop and philosophize and think about the reasons why they were here. If they did that, they would lose morale because, like I said, it should have never happened. They shouldn't have been there in the first place. And so eventually, another theme of the book, besides just the realities of the horrors of warfare and combat, is survival and your human side being reduced to your animal side by just thinking about living with between the rush of like bipolar levels of fear and then needing to eliminate that fear by taking control so you can perform, because as successful as you are as your job as a Marine in Vietnam, it will help determine the odds of your chances of surviving. And this is a very ugly truth about this particular war, is that it wasn't about any sort of altruistic cause. At some point it really has this underlying feel of every man for himself, and where the causes for the war are not totally just, things do break down and morale does break down, and there isn't a larger, better cause or altruistic sense of unity beyond the people for their friends in battle. That is also a theme, and that remains the love and comradeship that comes from going through such a harrowing, terrible experience together. But at the end of the day, it's also really about confronting survival, confronting one's mortal fears. And these young guys are basically, there comes a point where that's all they can see, because death is such a reality for them. It becomes something they get used to. If you're interested in being confronted by something like that, an experience that you're unlikely to ever have in your life, where like you're surrounded by the reality of the actual frailty of life, something that most people don't want to read about. They don't like, this is not a happy, escapist, nice story or some redeeming cause. This is the ugly, ugly reality of war. And for that, I absolutely loved this book. It was, so I actually found this for 50 cents at a used bookstore at a mall. And the cover looked cool, and I got out my smartphone and I was like, yeah, this has got good reviews on Goodreads. Why the hell not? So I got it, and it was 10 times better than I thought it would be. So I'm so pleased with this turnout. I'm going to do that more often. I'm going to buy random books that I'd never heard of in my life before. I think this is underrated. I don't want it to be forgotten in time. Probably will be. I hate to be pessimistic, but yeah, a few other things I forgot to say that I want to say. The prose is blunt, and one of the things I was saying before but forgot to tie off is that it's a strength and a weakness that the characters are young and they don't come from particularly educated backgrounds. There's an authenticity there that makes it realistic, and through their eyes you're able to see the blunt, ugly realities of war from a level that I haven't really seen before in a movie or a book or anything. But at the same time, that seems like it could be a little bit of a missed opportunity to really go into detail on the pointlessness of the Vietnam War in particular, because they never really intellectualize it. They never develop resentment, or they don't have any sort of philosophical or political opinion about anything. It eventually just becomes a job, and it's like live or die. In other words, the characters aren't very bright but there is a sort of weird other kind of intellectual capacity that comes from just being down to earth, I guess you could say, and that makes the characters highly sympathetic and making the book even more emotionally devastating at the same time, but in a way that isn't expounded on with any sort of poetic language that would drive the point home on an emotional level. So that feels like a slight missed opportunity. And I wouldn't say that makes it a sort of like, that's not what makes it YA, that simplicity. That's just the perspective characters that this author went for. And so it is a little bit simplistic, but the basics, it drives home in a way that is surprisingly believable, immersive. Like I said, it feels like this could have been a first-hand account. There wasn't any unrealistic things happening that totally took me out of the story. If you are actually researched on some of the realities of things that soldiers went through in Vietnam, there's this weird, brief tangent, there's this weird dynamic that I've seen among people that haven't really been experienced in the real world with people in difficult situations, whether it doesn't have to be as extreme as like a battlefield, but to be disbelieving when they hear extraordinary stories. People that grew up watching a lot of TV and most of their life is online or in media or video games or television, it's really sad. I remember an example of people commenting on the 2012 remake of Red Dawn on YouTube, and somebody saying like, oh, it was unrealistic that a teenage girl picked up an RPG and just easily shot it with no kickback. And then there was a reply of a Marine or ex-Marine who said, actually, women go through training and fire RPGs all the time because it's actually surprisingly easy. A child could do it. So it's this, people like are like self-deceiving. When they hear extraordinary things, there were so many, the realities of combat, and not just combat, but the horrors of war, and the Vietnam War in particular, can be an eye-opening thing when giving you perspective into what people are capable of, like the improvising and ingenuity and creative process when pressure is extremely high, the unlikely outcomes of certain things. Like, it is objectively fascinating way to get close to some of the harsher realities of life, living, mortality, that sort of thing, if you're interested in that sort of thing. And also what motivates people, what breaks people, different angles of psychology, if you pull meaning from that, like I certainly do. So I'm definitely drawn to more of the sort of forbidden knowledge, challenging reading than I am lately than I am for escapist, like idealistic things. Not that I don't occasionally like escapist, idealistic things. I do. I love it. But lately I've been in the mood to read something a little bit hard edge. So I highly recommend Fallen Angels by Walter Dean Myers, if that sounds like your sort of thing. It is a very soul-sucking, like draining, emotionally draining experience, though. So you've been warned. 9 out of 10, almost great, almost perfect, good book. More book reviews later. Ciao.